What happens when the man you've traveled 1,000 miles to marry looks you in the eye and tells you he never wanted a wife at all? When Lillian Moore stepped off that stagecoach in Red Hollow, she thought she was arriving at her new beginning. Instead, she walked straight into the most humiliating moment of her life, rejected in front of an entire town by the very man who'd sent for her. This is the story of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a man too broken to believe in second chances. Stay with me until the end, and please, comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lillian's story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust and broken dreams. Lillian Moore pressed her gloved hand against the wooden frame of the door and steadied herself as the driver climbed down from his perch. Through the small window, she could see Red Hollow spreading out before her like a collection of sun-bleached bones scattered across the prairie. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, a single dirt road lined with weathered buildings, their paint peeling in long strips like old skin. A general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple that looked like it was trying to point toward heaven but had gotten lost along the way. This was it. This was home now. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs as she smoothed down the front of her traveling dress, the nicest thing she owned, though the fabric had seen better days. The hem was dusty from the journey, and there was a small tear near the waist that she'd tried to mend 3 times but never quite managed to fix properly. She'd wanted to look perfect for this moment. She'd wanted to step off this coach looking like the kind of woman a man would be proud to call his wife. Instead, she looked exactly like what she was, desperate. "Miss Moore?" The driver's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of sympathy and impatience. "We're here." Lillian nodded and accepted his outstretched hand, stepping down onto the hard-packed earth of Red Hollow's main street. Her legs trembled, partly from the long journey, partly from the terror that had been building in her chest for the past 3 days. She was about to meet her future husband for the first time. Elias Turner. The name had lived in her mind for 6 weeks, ever since his letter had arrived at the boarding house in St. Louis, where she'd been working as a seamstress. The letter had been brief, almost businesslike, but it had offered her something she'd stopped believing she'd ever have. A chance. Seeking a wife. Must be hard-working and of good character. Life on a cattle ranch is difficult but honest. Respond if interested. Lillian had responded the same day. She told herself it didn't matter that she knew nothing about him except what could be conveyed in 3 short letters. She'd told herself it didn't matter that she'd never seen his face, never heard his voice, never stood in the same room with him. What mattered was that he was willing to give her a life that didn't involve sewing until her fingers bled or skipping meals to save money for rent she could barely afford. What mattered was that he wanted her, or at least she'd thought he did. Now, standing in the dusty street with her small trunk at her feet and the eyes of the entire town on her, Lillian felt the first cold fingers of doubt creeping up her spine. "You'll be Miss Moore, then," the voice came from her left. A woman's voice, sharp and curious. Lillian turned to find a small cluster of townspeople had gathered on the wooden sidewalk, studying her with the frank, unabashed interest of people who didn't get many visitors. The woman who'd spoken was middle-aged, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Lillian's appearance in a single sweeping glance. "Yes," Lillian said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Lillian Moore. I'm here to meet Elias Turner's mail-order bride," the woman finished, and there was something in her tone that made the words sound like an accusation. "We heard he'd sent for someone. Surprised it actually happened, if I'm being honest. Elias isn't exactly the marrying type." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd, and Lillian felt her cheeks begin to burn. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment. In her mind, Elias would have been here waiting for her. He would have helped her down from the coach and looked at her with something like relief or gladness, or at least basic human warmth. Instead, she was standing alone in the middle of the street while strangers discussed her situation like it was the most interesting piece of gossip they'd heard all month. "Mrs. Crawford, that's enough!" Another voice, this one male and carrying the weight of authority. A man stepped forward from the shadow of the general store, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. His face was kind, creased with lines that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "The young lady just arrived," he said firmly, his eyes on the gray-haired woman. Maybe we could give her a moment to catch her breath before we start in with the gossip. Mrs. Crawford sniffed but stepped back, and the sheriff turned to Lillian with an apologetic expression. I'm Sheriff Hayes. Welcome to Red Hollow, Miss Moore. I apologize for the reception. Small towns and new arrivals. Folks get curious. It's all right, Lillian said, though it wasn't. Her hands were shaking now, and she clasped them together to hide it. Is Mr. Turner here? I was expecting that... He's coming. The sheriff nodded toward the far end of the street, where a figure had appeared on horseback. That'll be him now. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Even from a distance, even with the afternoon sun in her eyes, she could see that Elias Turner was not the man she'd imagined. He sat on his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his posture straight and rigid, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A rough canvas shirt stretched across wide shoulders, worn leather gloves, a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble, and scars. Even from 20 feet away, she could see the scars. One ran from his left temple down past his cheekbone, a pale, jagged line that looked like it had been made by something sharp and unforgiving. Another crossed his neck just above his collar. There were probably more hidden beneath his clothes. She could tell by the way he moved, careful and controlled, like a man who'd learned the hard way that pain was always waiting. He reined his horse to a stop 10 feet from where Lillian stood, and looked down at her with eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and absolutely cold. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lillian felt the weight of those eyes on her, cataloging, assessing, and finding her wanting. She wanted to say something, to break the terrible silence that had fallen over the street, but her voice had abandoned her. All she could do was stand there with her heart pounding and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Finally, Elias dismounted. He moved with the economy of someone who never wasted emotion, swinging down from the saddle and landing lightly despite his size. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared on horseback, at least 6 feet tall, with the kind of solid, weathered build that came from years of hard labor. The scars were more visible now, too, telling stories of violence that Lillian couldn't begin to guess at. He took 3 steps toward her and stopped. You're Lillian Moore. It wasn't a question. Yes. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely more than a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Yes, I am, and you must be... I sent for help. The words came out flat and emotionless, cutting her off mid-sentence. Not a wife. The world tilted sideways. For a moment, just a moment, Lillian was sure she'd misheard him. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. She'd traveled over 1,000 miles. She'd spent every penny she had saved on the train tickets and the stagecoach fare. She'd left behind the only life she'd ever known on the strength of 3 letters and a promise. I don't understand, she heard herself say. The words sounded like they were coming from very far away. Your letter said, my letter was written by my neighbor's daughter, who thought she was doing me a favor. Elias's voice remained utterly flat, as cold and remote as those pale eyes. I told her I needed someone to help with the work around the ranch, someone to cook and clean and earn their keep. She took it upon herself to place an advertisement for a mail-order bride. Behind Lillian, someone in the crowd made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but close. Someone else whispered something she couldn't quite catch. The burning in her cheeks had spread down her neck and across her chest. She felt like her entire body was on fire, like she might actually burst into flames right there in the middle of Main Street. But you wrote back, she managed. Her voice was shaking now, betraying her. You sent 3 letters. You knew I was coming. I didn't read them. Elias shifted his weight, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, but close. Lucy, the neighbor's daughter, she handled all the correspondence. I didn't know what she'd done until 2 weeks ago when I found the letters in my desk. By then, you were already on your way. And you didn't think to send a telegram? The words burst out of Lillian before she could stop them, sharp and accusing. You couldn't have warned me? Saved me the journey? I considered it? Elias's jaw tightened. But the fact is, I do need help. The ranch is too much for one man, and I can't afford to hire proper staff. So if you're willing to work, really work, not just play at keeping house, then you can stay on as hired help. You'll have room and board and a small wage at the end of each month. Hired help? Lillian repeated the words slowly, tasting how bitter they were. You want me to be your servant. I want you to earn your keep, same as anyone else would. Elias's expression didn't change. The choice is yours, Miss Moore. You can take the stagecoach back east when it returns tomorrow morning, or you can stay and work. But I won't pretend this is something it's not. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not interested in marriage. And if that's what you came here expecting, then you've wasted your time. The silence that followed was deafening. Lillian stood frozen, aware of every eye on her, every whisper barely contained, every judgment being passed. This was worse than anything she'd imagined, worse than arriving to find Elias ugly or mean or already married. At least those scenarios would have been clean, definitive. She could have gotten back on the stagecoach with her dignity intact, her pride bruised but not shattered. This was different. This was being told she wasn't wanted, wasn't needed, wasn't enough, all while being offered the consolation prize of servitude. Her first instinct was to refuse, to tell Elias Turner exactly what he could do with his offer and walk away with her head held high. She had that right. She deserved at least that much respect. But as she opened her mouth to do exactly that, reality crashed down on her like a physical weight. She had $17 left to her name. The return ticket would cost $12. That left $5. Barely enough to survive for a week, let alone find new work and a place to live. She'd quit her position at the boarding house before leaving St. Louis. There was nothing to go back to, no job, no room, no prospects. She was completely, utterly alone. I need to think, she heard herself say. Her voice sounded hollow, defeated. I need time to take all the time you need. Elias gestured toward the small trunk at her feet. Your things can stay at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Fletcher runs it, second building past the church. Tell her I'll settle the bill tomorrow either way. He turned away before Lillian could respond, moving back toward his horse with that same careful, controlled grace. It was only as he was swinging back into the saddle that he paused and looked back at her one more time. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice was slightly softer now, or maybe she was just imagining it. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. That wasn't fair to you. Then he was gone, riding back down the street the way he'd come, leaving Lillian standing in the dust with her shattered dreams scattered at her feet. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting back to their business with barely concealed excitement. Lillian knew what they'd be talking about over dinner tonight. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected in the middle of Main Street, the desperate woman from back east who'd thrown herself at a man who didn't want her. She'd be the subject of gossip for weeks, maybe months. Come on, dear. A gentle hand touched her elbow, and Lillian looked up to find an older woman standing beside her. Not Mrs. Crawford from before, but someone else, with a softer face and kind eyes. Let's get you settled. I'm Mrs. Fletcher. I run the boarding house Elias mentioned. Lillian nodded numbly and bent to pick up her trunk, but Mrs. Fletcher stopped her. Leave it, she said firmly. My son will bring it along. You look like you're about to fall over. She wasn't wrong. Now that the initial shock was wearing off, Lillian felt exhausted down to her bones. The journey had been long, the past few minutes had been devastating, and she honestly didn't know if she had the strength to take another step. But she did. She always did. That was what Lillian Moore had learned in her 24 years on this earth. You kept going even when you wanted to stop. You took the next step even when your legs were shaking. You survived because the alternative wasn't an option. So she let Mrs. Fletcher guide her down the street, past the curious stares and barely contained whispers, toward a small two-story building with a sign that read, Fletcher's Boarding House, in faded letters. The room Mrs. Fletcher showed her to was tiny but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the dusty street. Lillian sank down onto the mattress and stared at her hands, still gloved, still clasped together, still trembling slightly. I'll bring you some tea, Mrs. Fletcher said gently. And some supper, if you're hungry. I'm not. Lillian's voice came out flat. But thank you. Mrs. Fletcher hesitated in the doorway. For what it's worth, dear, Elias Turner isn't a bad man. He's just broken. Lost his wife and son 5 years back in a fire. Hasn't been the same since. Lillian looked up sharply. He was married? For 3 years. Sarah was her name. Sweetest thing you ever saw. The boy was only 2 when it happened. Mrs. Fletcher's expression was deeply sad. Elias tried to save them, but the house went up too fast. He got the scars pulling their bodies out afterward. Some people say he should have died in there too, but the Lord had other plans, I suppose. The information settled over Lillian like a heavy blanket. It didn't excuse what Elias had done, humiliating her in front of the whole town, offering her servitude instead of the life he'd promised. But it explained some things. The coldness in his eyes, the rigid control in every movement, the flat, emotionless way he'd spoken. He wasn't just broken. He was haunted. "I'll leave you to rest," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. "But Lillian, think carefully before you decide. I know what happened today wasn't what you hoped for, but staying might not be the worst thing. Lord knows that ranch could use a woman's touch, and Elias could use someone who isn't afraid to stand up to him." Then she was gone, leaving Lillian alone with her thoughts. The sun was setting outside the window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Lillian watched the colors shift and change as darkness crept across the prairie, and she thought about the impossible choice in front of her. She could leave, take the stagecoach tomorrow morning and head back east with what little money she had left. Try to find work in another city, another boarding house, another life of barely scraping by. It would be hard, but she'd managed hard before. Or she could stay, accept Elias Turner's cold offer and become a servant in the house that should have been hers. Work herself to exhaustion for room and board and a pittance of a wage. Live with the constant reminder that she hadn't been wanted, hadn't been chosen, hadn't been enough. Both options felt impossible. Both felt like different versions of the same defeat. But as Lillian sat there in the growing darkness, watching the last light fade from the sky, she realized something. She'd been defeated before. She'd been unwanted before. She'd spent most of her life being not quite enough for the people around her, and she'd survived it all. Maybe that was what she did. Maybe survival was her particular talent, not grace or beauty or charm, but the sheer stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Lillian closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would make her decision. Tomorrow, she would choose between 2 impossible paths and learn to live with the consequences. But tonight she would let herself feel the full weight of her disappointment. Tonight, she would grieve for the dream that had died in the dust of Main Street. Tonight, she would be exactly what she was, a woman who'd traveled 1,000 miles to find home and discovered nothing but heartbreak instead. The tears came slowly at first, then faster, until Lillian was sobbing into her hands with a force that shook her entire body. She cried for the hope she'd carried across the prairie. She cried for the letters she'd read so many times the paper had grown soft. She cried for the version of herself who'd stepped off that stagecoach believing she was wanted. And she cried for the future that had been stolen from her by a grieving man who couldn't see past his own pain to recognize that she was in pain too. When Mrs. Fletcher came back an hour later with tea and bread, she found Lillian exactly where she'd left her, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. "Have you decided?" the older woman asked softly. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, a gesture that was pure defiance, pure stubbornness, pure refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed someone with less determination. "I'm staying," she said. Her voice was steady now, hard as iron. "I'm staying, and I'm going to work harder than Elias Turner has ever seen anyone work. I'm going to prove that I'm not some delicate flower who'll wilt at the first sign of difficulty. And maybe, just maybe, I'll show him that sending for me wasn't a mistake after all." Mrs. Fletcher smiled, the first genuine smile Lillian had seen since arriving in Red Hollow. "Good girl," she said simply. "Now eat your supper and get some rest. You're going to need your strength for tomorrow." As it turned out, that was the understatement of the century. When Lillian woke the next morning, her decision felt less like courage and more like madness. But she got dressed anyway, braided her hair, and walked down to the street where Elias was supposed to meet her. He was there, sitting on his horse with that same rigid posture, those same cold eyes. When he saw her approaching with her trunk, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or possibly disappointment. "You're staying," he said flatly. "I'm staying." Lillian lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "You offered me work, Mr. Turner. I'm accepting." For a long moment, Elias just looked at her, and Lillian had the distinct impression he was reconsidering the entire arrangement. Then he dismounted and moved to take her trunk, loading it onto the back of a small wagon she hadn't noticed before. "The ranch is an hour's ride," he said without looking at her. "We'll need to get supplies from the general store first. Make a list of what you think you'll need for cooking and housekeeping. I'll settle the account." "I don't need charity," Lillian said sharply. "Take whatever I spend out of my wages." Elias's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Suit yourself." They worked in stiff, uncomfortable silence, gathering flour and sugar and coffee and all the mundane necessities of keeping a household running. The general store owner, a nervous little man with thinning hair, kept shooting curious glances between them, clearly dying to ask questions, but not quite brave enough. When they were finally loaded up and ready to leave, Elias helped Lillian onto the wagon bench with the same careful, impersonal courtesy he might have shown a stranger. Then he climbed up beside her, took the reins, and guided the horses out of town without another word. The road to the ranch was rough and dusty, cutting through miles of open prairie that seemed to stretch on forever. Lillian had thought St. Louis was isolated, but this was something else entirely. A vast emptiness that made her feel impossibly small and alone. "There are rules," Elias said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of 30 minutes. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. "You'll sleep in the small cabin behind the main house. Used to be for hired hands, but it's been empty for a while. You'll need to clean it out." "That's fine," Lillian said quietly. "You'll take your meals in the kitchen, breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon, dinner at sundown. I expect the work to be done properly. No cutting corners, no complaints." "I understand." "And one more thing." Elias's hands tightened on the reins. "Stay out of the east bedroom on the second floor. That room stays locked. You don't go in there, you don't ask about it, you don't even look at it. Are we clear?" Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. The east bedroom, where his wife and son had died, presumably, where he kept his grief locked away. "Clear," she said softly. They didn't speak again for the rest of the journey. When the ranch finally came into view, Lillian's first thought was that it looked lonely. The main house was solidly built but weathered, its paint faded to gray, its porch sagging slightly on one end. There was a barn, a small stable, and several other outbuildings scattered around the property. Beyond that, nothing but prairie and sky and the distant shadow of mountains on the horizon. This was going to be her home now, this isolated, lonely place where dreams came to die. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down without waiting for her. "I'll show you where things are," he said curtly. "Then I have work to do." The tour was brief and businesslike. Kitchen, parlor, study, 2 bedrooms upstairs, one open, one locked. The small cabin out back where Lillian would be sleeping. It was dusty and full of cobwebs, but it had a bed and a stove and a door that locked from the inside. "I'll expect breakfast at dawn," Elias said from the doorway. Then he was gone, striding back toward the main house without a backward glance. Lillian stood in the middle of her new home, if it could even be called that, and felt the weight of her situation settle over her like a physical thing. She was 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, living as a servant in the house that should have been hers, working for a man who looked at her like she was a mistake he was being forced to tolerate. This was rock bottom. This was as low as she could possibly fall, but Lillian Moore had learned a long time ago that rock bottom was just another place to plant your feet and start climbing. So she rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and got to work. The first week passed in a blur of exhaustion and silent endurance. Lillian woke before dawn every morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. She'd stumble out of her small cabin in the darkness, her fingers stiff with cold, and make her way to the main house where she'd start the fire in the kitchen stove and begin preparing breakfast. By the time Elias appeared, always exactly at dawn, never a minute early or late, there would be coffee boiling, bacon frying, and biscuits in the oven. He never thanked her, never commented on the food except to occasionally grunt something that might have been approval. He'd eat in silence, standing by the window with his plate in one hand, looking out at the land like he was checking for threats. Then he'd set his empty plate on the counter, pull on his hat, and disappear for hours without a word about where he was going or when he'd be back. Lillian would clean up the breakfast dishes, then turn her attention to the endless list of tasks that seemed to multiply every time she finished one. The house hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years. That much was obvious from the dust layered thick on every surface and the way the floors creaked under accumulated grime. The curtains were so faded and moth-eaten they practically disintegrated when she took them down to wash. The pantry was a disaster of half-empty sacks and jars covered in ancient spills, and that was just the inside. Outside, the chicken coop needed mucking, the vegetable garden had been overtaken by weeds, and the porch steps were rotting through in 2 places. Lillian had to watch where she stepped every time she came in or out, terrified she'd put her foot straight through the wood. She worked until her hands blistered and her back ached and her eyes burned with fatigue. She worked until she was too tired to think, too tired to feel sorry for herself, too tired to cry about the life she'd lost before she ever really had it. And through it all, Elias Turner watched her with those cold, assessing eyes, waiting for her to fail. On the 8th day, she nearly gave him the satisfaction. She'd been up since 4 that morning, unable to sleep through the sound of rain hammering on the cabin roof. By the time she made it to the kitchen, she was already soaked through, her skirts heavy with water and her boots squelching with every step. The fire wouldn't catch, the wood was damp and the kindling kept sputtering out, and after 20 minutes of trying, Lillian wanted to scream with frustration. "You're doing it wrong!" The voice came from behind her, flat and critical, and Lillian spun around to find Elias standing in the doorway. He must have come in through the front of the house, silent as a ghost. In the gray morning light, his scars looked deeper, more pronounced, like someone had carved pieces out of his face and forgotten to smooth the edges. "The wood's wet," Lillian said through gritted teeth. She was shivering now, cold and miserable and at the absolute end of her patience. "I'm doing the best I can." "Your best isn't good enough if breakfast isn't ready." Elias crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and crouched down beside the stove, examining her failed attempts with a critical eye. "You need to build a base with the driest pieces first. Create airflow. You're smothering it." He demonstrated with quick, efficient movements, and within 2 minutes had a small flame crackling steadily. Then he stood up and looked down at her with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been something else entirely. "I thought you said you could handle the work," he said. Something inside Lillian snapped. She'd been holding it in for over a week. All the anger, all the humiliation, all the bitter resentment that came with being unwanted and undervalued and treated like she should be grateful for the privilege of servitude. But in that moment, standing there soaked and shivering and so tired she could barely see straight, she simply couldn't hold it anymore. "I can handle the work," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "What I can't handle is being treated like I'm incompetent every time something doesn't go perfectly. The wood was wet, Mr. Turner. That's not a moral failing on my part. That's just weather." Elias's eyebrows rose slightly, the most expression she'd seen on his face since the day she arrived. "I didn't say it was—" "You didn't have to say it. It was written all over your face." Lillian took a step toward him, too angry now to be intimidated by his size or his scars or his cold disapproval. "You've been waiting for me to fail from the moment I got here. You want me to quit so you can tell yourself you were right all along, that I was just some foolish woman who couldn't handle ranch life. Well, I'm not going to give you that satisfaction." For a long moment, Elias just stared at her. Then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. Lillian wasn't sure this man was capable of smiling, but it was something. Some tiny crack in the ice that had surrounded him since the moment they met. "You've got a temper," he said, and there was something almost like approval in his voice. "Didn't expect that." "There are a lot of things about me you didn't expect," Lillian shot back, "because you never bothered to find out." The almost smile faded, and Elias's expression went carefully blank again. "You're right," he said quietly. "I haven't been fair to you, but fair doesn't change anything, Miss Moore. This is still what it is, and you're still here because you had nowhere else to go. Let's not pretend otherwise." He turned and walked out of the kitchen before Lillian could respond, leaving her standing there with her fists clenched and her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to run after him and tell him exactly what she thought of his cold pronouncements and his deliberate cruelty and his determination to keep everyone at arm's length. But instead she turned back to the stove, fed the small fire he'd built until it was roaring strong, and started making breakfast. Because that was what Lillian Moore did. She kept going. The confrontation seemed to shift something between them, though Lillian couldn't have said exactly what. Elias didn't become warm or friendly or anything resembling approachable, but he stopped watching her quite so critically. And occasionally, very occasionally, he'd offer a gruff piece of advice about the best way to handle some task or another. "The chickens lay better if you collect eggs in the afternoon instead of morning," he said one day, appearing at her elbow while she was cleaning out the coop. "The garden needs more water than you're giving it. Soil's too dry. That loose board on the porch, you're going to break your ankle if you don't fix it soon. I'll leave some nails and a hammer by the door." They weren't conversations exactly, more like pronouncements delivered from on high, as if Elias was some kind of oracle dispensing wisdom to lesser mortals. But Lillian found herself listening anyway, filing away each piece of information and using it to do her job better. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, the ranch began to change. The house grew cleaner, more organized. The kitchen started to smell like fresh bread and herbs instead of dust and neglect. The curtains she sewed from fabric purchased with her tiny wages let in light that hadn't touched those rooms in years. The garden, coaxed back to life with patient watering and weeding, began producing vegetables that actually tasted like something other than dirt. Even the animals seemed to respond to her presence. The chickens stopped being quite so aggressive when she collected eggs. The horses in the stable grew used to her voice and would nicker softly when she came to bring them water. There was an old barn cat, a battle-scarred Tom with half an ear missing, who'd been living wild for years but had started showing up on the porch steps every evening, waiting for the scraps Lillian saved from dinner. She named him General because of the imperious way he demanded tribute, and Elias actually laughed when she told him. It was a short laugh, quickly stifled, but it was real. And hearing it made something warm unfurl in Lillian's chest, some tiny hope that maybe, just maybe, the man underneath all that ice and grief was still human, after all. But then he'd turn away and the walls would slam back into place, and Lillian would remember that hoping for anything from Elias Turner was a fool's errand. 3 weeks after her arrival, Mrs. Fletcher came to visit. Lillian was in the garden when she heard the wagon rattling up the road, and she straightened from her weeding with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because she was desperately lonely, and the sound of another woman's voice would be a blessing. Dread because she knew exactly what this visit was, a social call designed to gather gossip about how the rejected mail-order bride was faring. "Lillian!" Mrs. Fletcher climbed down from her wagon with surprising agility for a woman of her age. She was carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her face was bright with curiosity barely disguised as concern. "My dear, look at you. You've got color in your cheeks again. I was worried you'd be pining away out here." "I've been too busy to pine," Lillian said, brushing dirt from her hands. It was the truth. Between the endless work and her bone-deep exhaustion, she barely had time to think, let alone indulge in self-pity. "Would you like to come inside? I can make tea." "That would be lovely." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes were already scanning the property, taking in the neat garden rows, the freshly swept porch, the new curtains visible through the windows. "My goodness, you've certainly made some changes around here. Place hasn't looked this good since Sarah was alive." The name hit Lillian like a physical blow. Sarah, Elias's dead wife, the woman whose shadow hung over everything in this house, whose locked bedroom Lillian passed every day, whose memory seemed to haunt every corner of the property. "I'm just doing my job," Lillian said quietly, leading Mrs. Fletcher toward the house. "Mr. Turner hired me to keep things clean and organized. That's what I'm doing." Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled like the bread Lillian had baked that morning. She put the kettle on and set out cups while Mrs. Fletcher settled herself at the table and uncovered her basket, revealing fresh apples and a jar of honey. "From my own trees," she said proudly. "Thought you might enjoy them. I imagine Elias isn't much for providing treats." "He provides everything I need," Lillian said carefully. She didn't want to criticize Elias to a virtual stranger, even if that stranger had been kind to her. It felt disloyal somehow, though she couldn't have said why. "He's been fair." Mrs. Fletcher made a small sound that might have been skepticism, but didn't push. Instead, she looked around the kitchen with frank appreciation. "You've done wonders in here. Windows are actually clean, table isn't covered in dust, and is that fresh bread I smell? I bake twice a week." Lillian poured hot water over tea leaves and brought the cups to the table. "Mr. Turner works hard. He needs decent food." "Mr. Turner," Mrs. Fletcher repeated the formal address with raised eyebrows. "You've been living here for 3 weeks and you're still calling him Mr. Turner?" "It's appropriate." Lillian wrapped her hands around her teacup, grateful for the warmth. "He's my employer. I'm his hired help. There's a proper way these things should be done." "Hired help who sleeps in the cabin out back and eats alone in the kitchen," Mrs. Fletcher said gently. "Lillian, dear, are you really all right out here? Because if Elias is mistreating you in any way—" "He's not." The words came out fierce and immediate, surprising even Lillian with their intensity. "He's cold and distant and barely speaks to me, but he's not cruel. He pays me what he promised. He doesn't make unreasonable demands, and he's never once—" She paused, searching for the right words. "He's never made me feel unsafe. That's more than I can say for some of the men I've worked for." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened with understanding. "I suppose that's true. And for what it's worth, I can see you're making a difference here. This place has been dying by inches for 5 years. It's good to see it coming back to life." They talked for another half hour about inconsequential things. Gossip from town, news about people Lillian had barely met, the weather and the crops and all the mundane details that made up frontier life. It was pleasant and normal and almost enough to make Lillian forget how lonely she'd been. But then Elias came in from the barn, his boots heavy on the porch steps, and everything changed. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Mrs. Fletcher sitting at his kitchen table, and something dangerous flashed across his face. "Mrs. Fletcher." "Elias." The older woman didn't seem intimidated by his sudden coldness. "I was just visiting with Lillian. Brought you both some apples from my trees." "That's kind of you." Elias's voice was flat, dismissive. "But I'm sure you have things to do back in town." It was the most blatantly rude thing Lillian had heard him say, and she felt her cheeks burn with secondhand embarrassment. But Mrs. Fletcher just smiled serenely and stood up, gathering her empty basket. "You're quite right. I should be getting back." She patted Lillian's shoulder in passing. "You take care of yourself, dear. And don't be a stranger. You're welcome in town any time you want to visit." After she left, the kitchen felt smaller, the silence more oppressive. Elias stood by the door like he was guarding it, his jaw tight and his eyes hard. "I'd prefer if you didn't encourage visitors," he said without looking at Lillian. "This isn't a social establishment." Lillian set down her teacup very carefully, fighting to keep her voice level. Mrs. Fletcher was being kind. She brought apples. She was gathering gossip to spread around town. Elias finally looked at her, and there was something almost like pain in his expression. "That's what people do here. They watch, and they whisper, and they make up stories about things that aren't any of their business." "What exactly do you think they're saying?" Lillian stood up, her earlier patience evaporating. "That the mail-order bride who got rejected is now working as your servant? That's not gossip, Mr. Turner. That's just facts." "They're saying more than that." Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "They're saying I've got a woman living on my property. They're making assumptions about what that means, about what's happening out here. And the longer you stay, the worse it's going to get." Understanding crashed over Lillian like cold water. "You're worried about your reputation." "I'm worried about yours." The words came out harsh, almost angry. "You think people are going to hire you for honest work after this? You think anyone's going to believe nothing inappropriate is happening? You're ruining yourself, Miss Moore, and you're too stubborn to see it." "Then why did you let me stay?" Lillian shot back. "If you were so concerned about propriety, why didn't you put me back on that stagecoach the day I arrived?" Elias opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "I don't know," he said finally, quietly. "I should have. Would have been better for both of us." He left before Lillian could respond, disappearing back outside into the afternoon sunlight. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the barn with that rigid, controlled posture that never seemed to relax. And for the first time, Lillian wondered if maybe Elias Turner wasn't just keeping her at a distance. Maybe he was keeping everyone at a distance. Maybe after losing everything that mattered, solitude was the only thing that felt safe. The thought should have made her angry. It should have reinforced every bitter feeling she'd harbored since that first day in town. Instead, it just made her sad. That evening, Lillian made chicken and dumplings for dinner. Real comfort food, the kind her mother used to make when Lillian was small and the world still made sense. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe as an apology for the argument, though she had nothing to apologize for. Maybe as a peace offering, though Elias didn't deserve peace. Maybe just because she was tired of fighting and wanted one meal to pass without tension. When she brought Elias his plate, he'd started eating in the parlor instead of the kitchen, putting even more distance between them. He looked at the food for a long moment before speaking. "My mother used to make this," he said quietly. "Haven't had it in 20 years. Lillian didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and turned to leave. "Wait!" She stopped, surprised. Elias never asked her to wait for anything. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You don't have to eat in the kitchen by yourself." It was the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get, Lillian realized. A small crack in the walls he'd built around himself, offering her a glimpse of something almost human underneath. She sat. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the oppressive, angry silence that had characterized their meals before. It was softer somehow, more companionable. Like maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to exist in the same space without constantly bracing for conflict. "The garden looks good," Elias said eventually. "Better than it has in years." "Thank you." Lillian took a sip of water, trying not to make too much of what was essentially the first compliment he'd ever given her. "I've been following the advice you gave me about watering. Sarah used to grow vegetables." The words came out careful, measured, like Elias was testing how much weight they could bear. She had a gift for it, could make anything grow, even in poor soil. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his dead wife, and Lillian felt the significance of it like a physical thing. She didn't respond immediately, afraid that any wrong word might shatter this fragile moment. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Lillian said finally, softly. She was. Elias stared down at his plate, and Lillian could see the grief etched into every line of his face. She deserved better than what she got. Better than dying in a fire because I was too slow, too stupid to save her. "That's not," Lillian started, but Elias cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault, or that I did everything I could, or any of the other platitudes people throw around when they don't know what else to say. I was there. I know what I failed to do." He stood up abruptly, his dinner only half finished. "Thank you for the meal. It was good." Then he was gone again, leaving Lillian alone with the ghost of a conversation that had almost been real. But something had shifted, something had cracked open, just the smallest amount. And over the following days, those cracks began to widen. Elias started spending more time around the house, instead of disappearing for hours at a time. He'd linger in the kitchen after breakfast, drinking a second cup of coffee while Lillian worked. He'd offer to help with heavy lifting when she was trying to move furniture to clean. Once, he even fixed the rotting porch steps without being asked, and when Lillian thanked him, he just shrugged and said it needed doing. They developed a routine that felt almost comfortable. Lillian would have meals ready at the appointed times, and Elias would eat in the parlor while she ate in the kitchen. Still separate, but not quite as isolated as before. Sometimes he'd make a comment about the food or ask about her progress on various projects around the house. The conversations were brief and practical, never straying into anything personal, but they were conversations nonetheless. And slowly, very slowly, Lillian began to see glimpses of the man Elias Turner might have been before tragedy carved pieces out of him. She saw it in the gentle way he handled the horses, speaking to them in a low voice that carried none of the coldness he showed to people. She saw it in how he'd leave small things for her, a hammer when she mentioned needing to fix something, extra firewood stacked by her cabin door before a cold night, a new pair of work gloves that appeared on the kitchen counter without comment. He never acknowledged these gestures, never drew attention to them. But they were there, small acts of consideration that said more than words could. One morning in late October, Lillian woke to find the first frost covering everything in a blanket of white. The cabin was freezing, the small stove had gone out during the night, and she dressed quickly, her teeth chattering as she pulled on layers of clothing. When she made it to the main house, she found Elias already in the kitchen with the fire roaring. There was coffee made, steam rising from the pot, and he pressed a cup into her hands without comment. "Drink," he said gruffly. "You look half frozen." Lillian wrapped her fingers around the hot tin and let the warmth seep into her bones. "Thank you." Elias poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The cabin's going to be too cold once real winter hits. Temperature drops to 20 below some nights." "I'll manage," Lillian said automatically. She'd learned not to complain, not to show weakness. "No, you won't." Elias shook his head. "You'll freeze to death, and then I'll have to explain to Sheriff Hayes why I let my hired help die of exposure." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "There's a spare bedroom upstairs. It's not the one that's locked. It's on the other side of the hall. You can move in there." Lillian nearly dropped her coffee. "I couldn't possibly." "You can, and you will." Elias's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "It's practical. The house is warm. The cabin isn't. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. Moving into the main house meant crossing a line, blurring the boundary between employer and employee that had kept them at a safe distance. It meant intimacy of a sort, sharing space, sharing air, sharing the long evenings and early mornings. It meant becoming part of Elias's life instead of just existing on the periphery of it. "What will people say?" Lillian asked quietly, echoing Elias's own concerns from weeks earlier. He met her eyes, and there was something fierce in his expression. "I don't care anymore. Let them talk. You're not dying in that frozen cabin just to protect my reputation." So Lillian moved into the spare bedroom with her few possessions, and the nature of their relationship shifted once more. It was strange at first, hearing Elias moving around in his room late at night, his footsteps heavy on the old floorboards. Strange to pass him in the hallway in the early morning, both of them still half asleep and rumpled. Strange to share the same space in a way that felt almost domestic, almost like they were actually building something together. But strange didn't mean bad. In fact, Lillian found herself growing comfortable with it in a way that probably should have worried her. She'd wake to the smell of coffee brewing and know that Elias was already up, starting his day. She'd hear him come in late from checking fences and feel oddly relieved that he was home safe. She'd catch herself listening for his footsteps, waiting for the sound of the door, measuring her day by the rhythm of his presence. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression that wasn't quite cold anymore. Something warmer flickered in those pale blue eyes, something that made Lillian's heart skip in her chest. She told herself it didn't mean anything, told herself she was just grateful for kindness after weeks of coldness, told herself that whatever she was feeling was just the natural result of prolonged proximity to another human being in this isolated place. But late at night, lying in her small bed with the sound of wind howling outside, Lillian would admit the truth to herself. She was starting to care about Elias Turner, not the cold, distant man who'd rejected her in the street, but the complicated, wounded person underneath. The man who left her firewood and fixed broken steps and made sure she had coffee on cold mornings. The man who was trying so hard not to let anyone in but couldn't quite manage to keep all the walls intact. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing that would lead to more heartbreak. But Lillian had never been particularly good at protecting her own heart. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing bitter cold and early darkness. The work changed with the seasons, less time in the garden, more time preserving food and keeping the fires burning. Lillian learned to bake bread in quantities that would last for days. to stretch supplies when trips to town became difficult, to exist in the quiet isolation of snow and wind and endless white. And through it all, she and Elias continued their careful dance, close, but not too close, warm, but not too warm, existing in the strange space between employer and something else entirely. But the fragile peace couldn't last forever. Nothing good ever did. The trouble started in early December when Mrs. Crawford came to visit. Lillian was kneading bread dough when she heard the wagon approaching and her hands stilled in the flour-dusted bowl. Visitors were rare this deep into winter, when the roads became treacherous with ice and the wind cut through layers of clothing like a knife. She moved to the window and saw Mrs. Crawford climbing down from her wagon with the determined air of a woman on a mission. This wasn't going to be a friendly social call. Lillian wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door before Mrs. Crawford could knock, mustering a polite smile she didn't feel. "Mrs. Crawford, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." The older woman's eyes were sharp as she stepped past Lillian into the warmth of the kitchen, her gaze immediately cataloging everything: the bread dough, the clean counters, the pot of stew simmering on the stove. "Is Elias here?" "He's out checking the cattle." Lillian kept her voice neutral. "He should be back within the hour if you'd like to wait." "I'll wait." Mrs. Crawford settled herself at the kitchen table without invitation, folding her hands in her lap. "Actually, it's just as well that he's not here. Gives us a chance to talk privately, woman to woman." A cold knot formed in Lillian's stomach. She returned to her bread dough, needing something to do with her hands. "About what?" "About the situation you've created here." Mrs. Crawford's tone was clipped, disapproving. "Surely you must know people are talking. A young, unmarried woman living alone with a man, sleeping under his roof. It's not decent, Lillian. It's not proper." "I'm his hired help," Lillian said, pressing her palms into the dough with more force than necessary. "I work for room and board. There's nothing indecent about it. You're living in his house, eating at his table, spending every hour of every day in his company." Mrs. Crawford leaned forward, her expression a mixture of concern and condemnation. "Do you really think anyone believes that's all that's happening? A young woman and a man in the prime of his life, isolated out here with no supervision, no chaperone. Nothing inappropriate is happening." The words came out sharp, defensive. Lillian forced herself to take a breath, to soften her tone. "Mr. Turner has been nothing but respectful. He needed help with the ranch, and I needed work. That's all this is." "Is it?" Mrs. Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're playing house with a man who's not your husband. And whether or not anything improper is actually occurring, the appearance of impropriety is just as damaging, perhaps more so." Lillian's hands stilled in the dough. "Why are you here, Mrs. Crawford? What do you want from me?" "I want you to consider your reputation, your future." The older woman's voice gentled slightly, as if she was trying to be kind. "You're a young woman, Lillian. You could still make a decent marriage, build a proper life for yourself. But not if you stay here. Not if you keep allowing yourself to be associated with a man who—" She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself. "A man who what?" Lillian turned to face her fully now, flour dusting her forearms. "Say what you came to say, Mrs. Crawford." The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Elias Turner is damaged goods, dear. Everyone in Red Hollow knows it. He's been half dead inside since the fire, and he's not coming back from that. Sarah was the making of him, and when she died, the best parts of him died too. You're wasting your time here, wasting your youth, on a man who will never be able to give you what you deserve." The casual cruelty of the words took Lillian's breath away. She'd heard people say harsh things before, had been on the receiving end of enough unkindness in her life to have developed thick skin. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about Elias, about reducing him to nothing more than his grief and his scars and his inability to move past tragedy. "You don't know him," Lillian said quietly, but there was steel underneath the quiet. "You don't know what he's capable of." "And you do?" Mrs. Crawford stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her skirts. "You've been here, what, 3 months? You think that's long enough to understand a man like Elias Turner? He's been broken for 5 years, Lillian. 5 years of refusing every woman who showed interest, of pushing away every offer of friendship or comfort, of choosing isolation over healing. What makes you think you're going to be the one to change him? I'm not trying to change him. But even as Lillian said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She had been trying, in small ways, to bring light back into this dark place, to make Elias smile, to soften the hard edges, to remind him that life could be more than just survival and grief. "Then what are you doing here?" Mrs. Crawford's voice was almost pitying now. "Because from where I stand, you're either trying to fix a broken man, which is a fool's errand, or you're fooling yourself into believing this arrangement is something other than what it is. A temporary convenience that will end badly for everyone involved." Before Lillian could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Elias stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and snow with him. He stopped short when he saw Mrs. Crawford, and his expression went immediately cold and closed. "Mrs. Crawford," his voice was flat, unwelcoming. "What brings you out here in this weather?" "I came to speak with you about Miss Moore." The older woman drew herself up to her full height, which still left her a good 6 inches shorter than Elias. "About the impropriety of this living situation and what it's doing to both of your reputations." Elias's jaw tightened. "My living arrangements are none of your concern. They're the concern of every decent person in Red Hollow." Mrs. Crawford's voice rose, gaining strength. "You can't keep a young woman living in your house without consequences, Elias. People are talking. The church congregation has discussed it. Even Sheriff Hayes thinks something should be done." "Sheriff Hayes can mind his own business." Elias moved further into the kitchen, his body language radiating tension. "As can you, and the church congregation, and everyone else who's so interested in my affairs. Miss Moore is my employee. She works hard, she keeps house, and that's the end of it." "Is it?" Mrs. Crawford looked between them with knowing eyes. "Because it seems to me there's quite a bit more to it than that. The way you look at her when you think no one's watching, the way she defends you. This isn't just an employer and employee, Elias, and you know it." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Lillian felt her face burning, felt the weight of Mrs. Crawford's words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to protest, to deny, to defend the careful boundaries she and Elias had maintained, but she couldn't. Because Mrs. Crawford was right. Somewhere along the way, this had become more than just a working arrangement. Somewhere in the long evenings and early mornings, in the shared meals and quiet conversations, in the small kindnesses and growing comfort, something had shifted. She'd stopped seeing Elias as just her employer and started seeing him as something else entirely. And the terrifying part was that she thought maybe, just maybe, he'd started seeing her differently too. "Get out!" Elias's voice was deadly quiet, more dangerous than if he'd shouted. "Get out of my house, and don't come back." Mrs. Crawford didn't flinch. "I'm trying to help you, Elias. Both of you. Before this situation gets even more out of hand, I said get out." Elias took a step toward her, and there was something in his posture that made Mrs. Crawford finally back toward the door. "You can tell Sheriff Hayes and the church congregation and everyone else in Red Hollow that what happens on my property is my business. If they have concerns, they can address them to me directly instead of sending you out here to harass my hired help." "This isn't over," Mrs. Crawford said as she reached the door. "The town isn't going to let this continue. There are standards of decency, Elias, even out here on the frontier. And if you won't protect Miss Moore's reputation, then someone else will have to." She left in a flurry of righteous indignation, and the sound of her wagon rattling away seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Lillian stood frozen by the table, her hands still coated in flour, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't look at Elias, couldn't face whatever she might see in his eyes. Anger, regret, or worst of all, confirmation that Mrs. Crawford had been right about everything. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to cause trouble for you." "You didn't cause anything." Elias moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "Small-minded people with nothing better to do. That's what caused this. Not you." But she was right about one thing. Lillian forced herself to continue, even though every word felt like pulling teeth. "People are talking, and the longer I stay here, the worse it's going to get. Maybe I should—" "Don't!" The single word came out harsh, almost desperate. Elias turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that Lillian had never seen before. Something raw and unguarded. Don't say you should leave. Don't even think it. But your reputation, to hell with my reputation. Elias crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, stopping just a few feet from where Lillian stood. Do you know what this place was like before you came here? It was dying. I was dying, going through the motions of living without any real reason to keep going. And then you showed up with your stubborn pride and your refusal to quit, and you brought this whole place back to life. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Elias, I treated you terribly when you first arrived. Worse than terribly. I was cruel and cold, and I rejected you in the worst possible way because I was scared. The words were tumbling out now, like a dam had broken. I was scared of needing anyone again, scared of caring about someone and losing them, scared of feeling anything except the grief that's been eating me alive for 5 years. I know, Lillian said softly. I understood even then. But you didn't leave. Elias's voice cracked slightly. You could have walked away with every justification in the world, and instead you stayed. You worked yourself half to death trying to prove something to me, and somewhere along the way you did. You proved that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I could let someone in without the world ending. Maybe I could care about someone again. The confession hung between them, fragile and precious and terrifying. Lillian felt tears burning behind her eyes, felt every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her own heart beginning to crumble. Are you saying? She couldn't finish the question, too afraid of the answer. I'm saying that Mrs. Crawford was right about one thing. Elias took another step closer, and now they were separated by less than a foot, close enough that Lillian could see the flecks of darker blue in his pale eyes. This stopped being just a working arrangement a long time ago. At least it did for me. Lillian's hands were shaking. She pressed them together, leaving smudges of flour on her apron. What are you asking me, Elias? I'm not asking anything. His voice gentled. I'm just telling you the truth. And the truth is that I care about you, Lillian, more than I should, more than is probably wise. And the thought of you leaving, of going back east or finding work somewhere else, of not being here. He stopped, swallowed hard. I can't stand it. Everything Lillian had been holding inside for months, all the hurt and hope and stubborn determination, came rushing to the surface. Then why did you keep pushing me away? Why did you make me sleep in that frozen cabin for 2 months? Why did you treat me like I was just a burden you had to tolerate? Because I was terrified. Elias reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. Of this, of feeling something real again. Of wanting someone and knowing that wanting means you can lose them. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love burn to death and not be able to stop it? To have to pull their bodies out of the ashes afterward? The raw pain in his voice made Lillian's chest ache. I can't imagine. I couldn't survive it again. Elias's eyes were bright now, suspiciously bright. If I let myself care about you, really care about you, and then something happened, if I lost you the way I lost Sarah and Thomas, it would destroy what's left of me. So I tried to keep you at a distance, tried to maintain the boundaries, but you made it impossible. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. By being you. A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's face. By refusing to be intimidated. By standing up to me when I was being cruel. By bringing life back to this place with your stubbornness and your strength and your complete inability to give up on anything, even when giving up would have been easier. He paused. Even when giving up on me would have been justified. Lillian felt the tears spilling over now, hot tracks down her cold cheeks. I couldn't give up on you. I tried at first, tried to tell myself this was just a job, just a way to survive. But somewhere along the way, I started to see past all the walls you built. I started to see the man underneath. The one who leaves firewood by my door and fixes broken steps and makes sure I have coffee on cold mornings. The one who talks to his horses in that gentle voice and feeds the barn cat even though he pretends not to. The one who's still capable of kindness, even after everything he's lost. Lillian. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. What are we doing here? I don't know. She gave a watery laugh. All I know is that Mrs. Crawford is right. This isn't just an employer and employee anymore. Maybe it never really was. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment like glass. Elias's head snapped toward the window, his entire body going rigid. Someone's coming, multiple riders. Lillian moved to stand beside him, peering out into the afternoon gloom. She could see at least 5 horses making their way up the road toward the ranch, moving with purpose. As they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Hayes in the lead, his badge catching what little light filtered through the clouds. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What's happening?" Elias's expression had gone hard again, all the vulnerability from moments before locked away behind ice. "Stay here." He strode out onto the porch, and Lillian followed despite his command, wrapping her arms around herself against the bitter cold. The riders pulled to a stop in the yard, and Lillian felt her stomach drop when she recognized some of the faces. Mrs. Crawford's husband, the minister from the church, several other prominent men from town. This was exactly what Mrs. Crawford had threatened, the town coming to enforce their standards of decency. "Elias!" Sheriff Hayes dismounted, his expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry about this, but we need to talk." "About what?" Elias's voice was dangerous, controlled. "About Miss Moore." The minister spoke up, a thin man with a pinched face that suggested he'd never smiled in his life. "About the improper situation you've allowed to develop here." "There's nothing improper happening," Elias said through gritted teeth. "Miss Moore is my employee, living in your house unchaperoned," Mr. Crawford cut in, his voice heavy with judgment. "Sleeping under your roof, spending her days and nights in your company with no witnesses to ensure propriety. It's a scandal, Elias, and it's reflecting poorly on the entire town." "The entire town can go straight to hell," Elias shot back. "What happens on my property is my business. Not when it involves the corruption of a young woman's virtue." The minister's voice rose, taking on the cadence of a sermon. "We have a responsibility as Christian men to protect the weak, to ensure that moral standards are maintained even in this harsh land. Miss Moore may not understand the danger she's placing herself in, but we do. The only danger she's in is from busybodies who can't mind their own business." Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sheriff Hayes held up a placating hand. "Elias, listen. Nobody's accusing you of anything specific. But the situation looks bad, and it's causing talk. For Miss Moore's own sake, something needs to change." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Lillian found her voice, stepping forward despite the way all the men's eyes immediately fixed on her. "That I leave? That I go back to sleeping in a frozen cabin so you can all feel better about your moral superiority?" "We're suggesting that you return to town," the minister said, his tone suggesting he was being infinitely patient with a difficult child. "Mrs. Fletcher has offered you a room at the boarding house, free of charge, until more appropriate work can be found for you. Work that doesn't require you to live in sin." "I'm not living in sin!" The words burst out of Lillian, hot and furious. "I'm working. I'm earning an honest wage for honest labor. The only sin here is the way you're all treating a private matter like it's your concern." "Your reputation is the concern of every decent person in Red Hollow," Mr. Crawford said firmly, "whether you understand that or not." "My reputation," Lillian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My reputation was destroyed the moment I stepped off that stagecoach and was rejected in front of the entire town. You all watched it happen. Some of you enjoyed it, and now you want to pretend you're protecting me? From what? From the only person who's treated me with any real kindness since I arrived?" "Lillian." Elias's voice was low, warning. "Don't." But Lillian was beyond caution now. 3 months of swallowed pride and silent endurance came pouring out in a flood of words. "You want to know what's really improper? Traveling 1,000 miles on the promise of marriage only to be told you're not wanted. Being forced to choose between servitude and starvation. Working yourself to exhaustion for people who will never see you as anything more than a mistake that needs to be corrected. That's what's improper. Not this." She gestured between herself and Elias, her chest heaving. "Mr. Turner has been nothing but respectful. He gave me work when I had nothing. He gave me shelter when I would have frozen. He's treated me with more dignity than anyone in that town ever has, including all of you. So if you want to enforce your standards of decency, Maybe start with examining your own behavior instead of coming out here to harass people who are just trying to survive." The silence that followed was absolute. The minister's face had gone red with outrage. Mr. Crawford looked like he'd been slapped. Even Sheriff Hayes seemed at a loss for words, his weathered face creased with discomfort. And then Elias stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Lillian in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. "You heard her," he said quietly. "Miss Moore stays. She works for me, she lives in my house, and what anyone in town thinks about it is irrelevant. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me directly instead of organizing a mob to intimidate a woman who's done nothing wrong." "This isn't over," the minister said, his voice shaking with righteous fury. "The church will not stand by while The church doesn't have jurisdiction over my property," Elias interrupted coldly, "and neither do you or anyone else here. Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Lillian found herself holding her breath, waiting to see if the situation would escalate into something worse. Then Sheriff Hayes sighed heavily and remounted his horse. "Come on, this isn't going to be settled today." The other men followed reluctantly, Mr. Crawford and the minister both shooting dark looks back at the porch. As they rode away, the minister's voice carried back on the wind. "This is a matter for the church council. Something will be done." The words felt like a threat. When the last rider disappeared down the road, Elias remained standing rigid on the porch, staring after them. Lillian moved to stand beside him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Lillian said finally. "I shouldn't have said all that. I made things worse." "You didn't make anything worse." Elias turned to look at her, and there was something fierce in his expression. "You told the truth. They didn't want to hear it, but that doesn't make it any less true." "But now they're going to—" Lillian stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. What exactly were they going to do? Force her to leave? Bring legal action against Elias? She didn't know enough about frontier law to understand what power the church actually held. Let them try. Elias's jaw was set in a hard line. "I'm done caring what people think. I'm done letting fear dictate how I live my life. And I'm done pretending that having you here is anything other than the best thing that's happened to this place in 5 years." The words sent warmth flooding through Lillian's chest, but it was tempered by reality. "Elias, you can't just defy the entire town. They have power here, social power, if nothing else. They can make our lives miserable." "Our lives?" Elias caught the phrase, his eyes searching hers. "You're planning to stay then? Even after all this?" "Where else would I go?" Lillian spread her hands helplessly. "You're right. This place, it's become home. I don't want to leave." Something in Elias's expression softened. "Then don't. We'll figure this out together." But even as he said it, Lillian could see the doubt in his eyes. The fear that maybe this time standing his ground wouldn't be enough. That maybe the town really could force them apart, could enforce their standards through pressure and judgment and social isolation. They stood together on the porch as darkness fell, watching the snow begin to fall again, and Lillian felt the weight of an impossible choice settling over her shoulders. She could leave and protect both of their reputations, go back to town and try to salvage some kind of decent future from the wreckage. Or she could stay and fight for something that felt real and precious and worth defending, even if it meant becoming an outcast in the only community for 100 miles. But as she glanced at Elias, at the hard set of his jaw and the protective way he stood beside her and the lingering warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, Lillian realized the choice had already been made. She wasn't leaving. Not for Mrs. Crawford's disapproval or the minister's righteous fury or the entire town's condemnation. She was staying, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. That night, after a silent dinner where neither of them could quite meet the other's eyes, Lillian lay awake in her small bedroom listening to the wind howl outside. She could hear Elias pacing in his room across the hall, restless footsteps back and forth, back and forth. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, she got up and padded across the cold floor to her door. She opened it to find Elias standing in the hallway, one hand raised as if he'd been about to knock. "I can't sleep," he said unnecessarily. "Neither can I." Lillian pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. What are we going to do, Elias? I don't know. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. I keep thinking there must be a solution, some way to make this right, but I can't see it. There is one solution. Lillian forced herself to say it, even though the words tasted bitter. I could marry someone else, someone respectable. That would end the scandal. Elias's expression went absolutely still. Is that what you want? No. The word came out fierce, immediate. No, that's the last thing I want. But if it would protect you... Stop. Elias reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. Don't even think that. I didn't defend you today just to hand you off to some other man who sees you as a solution to a problem. Then what? Lillian's voice cracked. Because they're not going to let this go, Elias. You know they're not. They'll keep pushing until something breaks. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Then he looked up and met her eyes, and there was something determined in his expression. Then let it break, he said softly, and we'll build something new from the pieces. The words felt like a promise, like a vow. And standing there in the darkened hallway with snow falling outside and the whole world seeming to press down on them, Lillian let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, promises were something worth fighting for after all. The next 3 days passed in tense silence, as if the entire ranch was holding its breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. Elias worked from dawn until well past dark, pushing himself with an intensity that bordered on reckless. Lillian watched him come in each night exhausted and covered in snow, his face drawn with worry he refused to voice, and her heart ached with the knowledge that he was suffering because of her. On the 4th day, Sheriff Hayes returned alone. Lillian saw him riding up the road just after breakfast and felt her stomach drop. She'd been expecting this, some kind of official visit, some ultimatum delivered with the weight of law behind it, but that didn't make it any easier to face. I'll handle this, Elias said grimly, already moving toward the door. No. Lillian caught his arm, surprising them both. We handle it together. Whatever they're going to say, I deserve to hear it. Something flickered in Elias's eyes. Pride, maybe, or respect, and he nodded once. They walked out onto the porch together as Sheriff Hayes dismounted, moving slowly like a man carrying a burden he didn't want. Elias, Miss Moore. He touched the brim of his hat, his weathered face apologetic. I was hoping we could talk. If you're here to arrest someone, just get on with it, Elias said flatly. Nobody's getting arrested. Sheriff Hayes climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. But the church council met yesterday, and they've made some decisions that I'm obligated to inform you about. What kind of decisions? Lillian heard herself ask, though part of her didn't want to know. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. They've drafted a formal complaint about the living situation here. They're planning to present it to the territorial judge when he comes through next month. They want a legal order requiring Miss Moore to leave the property and forbidding her from returning. The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. A legal order. They were actually going to try to force her out through the courts. On what grounds? Elias's voice was dangerous, controlled. What law are we breaking? Moral turpitude. Sheriff Hayes looked uncomfortable. Conduct unbecoming. They're arguing that the situation here represents a corruption of public morals and that the community has an interest in preventing scandal. He paused. It's thin, legally speaking. I'm not sure the judge will even hear it, but they're serious about pursuing this, Elias. Let them. Elias's jaw was set in that stubborn line Lillian had come to recognize. Miss Moore isn't going anywhere. There's more. Sheriff Hayes shifted his weight, looking even more uncomfortable. The church has also decided to withdraw its support from you. No more credit at the general store. No more assistance from the community during calving season or harvest. They're essentially going to treat you both as if you don't exist. Social death. That's what he was describing. Complete isolation from the only support network within 100 miles. No credit meant they'd have to pay cash for everything, and Lillian knew Elias's finances were stretched thin already. No community assistance during critical seasons could mean the difference between a successful ranch and complete failure. They can't do that, Lillian said, her voice shaking. They can't just cut someone off for what? For giving a woman honest work? They can do whatever they want, miss. Sheriff Hayes's expression was sympathetic but resigned. The church holds a lot of power in small towns like this, and when the church makes a decision, most folks fall in line whether they agree with it or not. Do you agree with it? Elias asked bluntly. Sheriff Hayes was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. I think it's harsh and unnecessary. I think you're both decent people trying to make the best of a difficult situation. But what I think doesn't matter much when the ministers got the whole congregation worked up about sin and scandal. So you came to warn us. Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the layers of clothing. To give us a chance to… what? Capitulate? To give you a chance to make your own decision before it gets made for you. Sheriff Hayes looked between them, his expression serious. There are options here. Miss Moore could move back to town, take a room at the boarding house like they suggested. You could hire a proper chaperone to live here, an older woman, someone beyond reproach. Or… he hesitated. Or what? Elias demanded. Or you could get married. The words came out quickly, as if Sheriff Hayes wanted to get them over with. That would end all this immediately. Can't claim impropriety if you're husband and wife. The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Lillian felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Marriage, the very thing she'd come here expecting, the dream that had been so cruelly denied, being offered now not as a gift but as a solution to a scandal. That's not… she started, but Elias cut her off. Give us a moment. His voice was tight, controlled. Please. Sheriff Hayes nodded and stepped off the porch, moving toward his horse to give them the illusion of privacy. The moment he was out of earshot, Elias turned to Lillian with an intensity that took her breath away. Don't say no yet, he said urgently. Just listen. Elias, we can't get married just to satisfy the church council. That's not why I'm suggesting it. He took her hands in his, and Lillian could feel them trembling slightly. Or maybe it is partly, but not just that. Lillian, these past few months with you here, you've changed everything. You've changed me. And I know this isn't how it should happen. I know you deserve better than a marriage proposal born out of scandal and pressure, but what? Lillian's voice came out as barely a whisper. But I don't want you to leave. The confession came out raw, honest. I don't want to wake up tomorrow and find you gone. I don't want to eat meals alone in a silent house or walk past your empty room or go back to existing instead of living. And if marrying me, if that's what it takes to keep you here, then I'm asking, not because I have to, because I want to. Lillian felt tears burning behind her eyes. You want to marry me? Yes. Elias's grip on her hands tightened. I know I have no right to ask. I know I treated you terribly when you first arrived, that I rejected you and humiliated you and made you feel unwanted. I know I'm broken and scarred and probably incapable of being the kind of husband you deserve. But if you'll have me, if you can forgive all of that and give me a chance, then yes, I want to marry you. It was everything Lillian had dreamed of hearing 3 months ago, but now it felt complicated by reality. What if you're only asking because you feel obligated? Because the town is forcing your hand? Then I guess we'll never know for sure. Elias gave her a crooked, almost smile that made her heart ache. But I can tell you this. I started feeling something for you weeks before the church council got involved. Weeks before Mrs. Crawford came out here stirring up trouble. I've been fighting it, trying to pretend it wasn't happening, but it was. You got under my skin, Lillian Moore. You made me care again when I'd sworn I never would. I'm scared, Lillian admitted quietly. What if you're wrong? What if this feeling you have is just, I don't know, gratitude? Proximity? What if you wake up in 6 months and realize you made a terrible mistake? What if you're the one who wakes up and realizes that, Elias countered. What if you marry me and then discover that living with a damaged, grief-stricken rancher is nothing like what you imagined when you answered that advertisement? What if I can never give you the kind of life you deserve? They stared at each other, both breathing hard, both terrified and hopeful in equal measure. This is insane, Lillian said finally. Completely insane, Elias agreed. We barely know each other. We've been living together for 3 months. We know each other better than most couples do before they marry. The whole town will say we're only doing this to avoid scandal. Let them say whatever they want. Elias pulled her closer, until they were separated by mere inches. I'm done caring what anyone thinks. The only opinion that matters to me is yours. So I'm asking you, Lillian, not because I have to, not because the church is forcing my hand, but because I want to. Will you marry me? Lillian looked up into his face. Those pale blue eyes, those terrible scars, that expression of desperate hope barely contained, and felt something settle into place in her chest, something that felt like certainty. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I'll marry you. The relief that flooded Elias's expression was almost painful to see. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Lillian could feel his heart pounding as fast as her own. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for asking. Lillian's voice was muffled against his shoulder. For choosing me when you didn't have to. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms on the porch, while Sheriff Hayes pretended to examine his saddle. Finally, Elias pulled back just enough to look at her face. There's one more thing, he said quietly, and I need you to understand this before we go through with it. I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I have nightmares about the fire. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night unable to breathe, convinced I can smell smoke. There are days when the grief hits me so hard I can barely function. I'm not healed, Lillian. I don't know if I'll ever be completely healed. I'm not asking you to be healed, Lillian said firmly. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you heal. There's a difference. Something in Elias's expression cracked open, and for just a moment Lillian saw the full depth of emotion he usually kept locked away. Then he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her face. I don't deserve you, he said softly. Probably not, Lillian agreed with a watery laugh. But you're stuck with me anyway. They broke apart reluctantly when Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat, a diplomatic reminder of his presence. Elias kept hold of Lillian's hand as they turned to face him, their fingers intertwined. We'll get married, Elias announced, as soon as it can be arranged. Sheriff Hayes's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. I was hoping you'd say that. Minister won't marry you, not after everything that's happened, but Judge Morrison is due through town next week for circuit court. He can perform the ceremony legally. Fine. Elias's voice was firm, brooking no argument. We'll come to town next week and make it official. There's going to be talk, Sheriff Hayes warned. People saying you're only doing this because you were caught out, that it's a shotgun wedding without the shotgun. Let them talk. Lillian surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. We know the truth. That's all that matters. After Sheriff Hayes left with promises to make the necessary arrangements, Lillian and Elias stood together on the porch watching him ride away. The snow had started falling again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. We should go inside, Elias said finally. It's freezing out here. But neither of them moved. There was something about this moment, standing on the threshold between their old lives and whatever was coming next, that felt too significant to rush past. I meant what I said, Elias told her quietly, about wanting this. It's not just about the scandal or the church council. You believe that, don't you? I believe you believe it right now. Lillian looked up at him, her expression serious. But Elias, you need to understand something too. I'm not Sarah. I can't be Sarah. I won't try to be her or replace her or make you forget her. If we're going to do this, you need to let me be myself. I don't want you to be Sarah. Elias's voice was fierce. Sarah was. Well, she was part of my past, and I'll always love her memory. But you're different. You're strong in ways she never had to be. You've survived things she never faced, and you're here now, real and solid and alive. That's what I want. Not a replacement or a substitute. You. The words loosened something in Lillian's chest that she hadn't realized was tight. Okay, she said softly. Okay. They went inside finally, seeking warmth and normalcy. Lillian made coffee while Elias stoked the fire, and they sat together at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many silent breakfasts and awkward dinners. But this time felt different. This time they were sitting as equals, as partners, as two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. "We should make a list," Lillian said suddenly, "of things we need to do before the wedding." Elias raised an eyebrow. "A list? I need a dress, something appropriate for getting married in. And we'll need witnesses. I suppose Sheriff Hayes can be one, but we'll need at least one more." Lillian was thinking out loud now, practical concerns pushing past the emotion of the moment. "And we should probably talk about the arrangements, after we're married. Where I'll sleep. What changes we'll make." "You'll sleep in the spare bedroom." Elias's voice was firm. "Unless or until you want something different. This marriage, I know it's happening quickly, under pressure. I'm not going to force intimacy just because we've said vows." The consideration in his words made Lillian's throat tight. "Thank you. Don't thank me for treating you with basic decency." Elias looked uncomfortable. "That should be the minimum expectation. You'd be surprised how many men don't meet even that minimum." Lillian took a sip of her coffee. "I've had 3 different employers try to take liberties over the years. One of the reasons I answered that advertisement was because I thought being married would protect me from that kind of attention." Elias's expression darkened. "Did they hurt you?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." Lillian kept her voice light, but she saw the way Elias's hands clenched on the table. "I learned early how to use a knee and where to aim it. But the point is, I know the difference between a man who respects boundaries and one who doesn't. You've never once made me feel unsafe in that way. That matters more than you know." They talked through the practical details as the morning wore on, making plans and contingencies and trying to prepare for a future that still felt surreal. By the time lunch needed preparing, they'd decided on almost everything. Lillian would wear the best dress she owned. They'd ask Mrs. Fletcher to serve as the second witness despite the church's disapproval, and they'd host a small dinner afterward for anyone brave enough to attend. "It won't be the wedding you dreamed of," Elias said as Lillian stood to start cooking. "I'm sorry for that. I stopped dreaming about perfect weddings a long time ago." Lillian turned to look at him, her expression serious. "All I ever really wanted was someone who'd stand beside me. Someone who'd choose me freely instead of out of desperation or convenience. You're giving me that, Elias. That's more than enough." The week that followed was a strange blur of preparation and anticipation. Lillian threw herself into work, scrubbing the house until it gleamed and preparing food for the small celebration they'd planned. Elias disappeared for an entire day and returned with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, offering it to Lillian with gruff embarrassment. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's real gold, and it's yours if you want it." Lillian held the ring in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the history. "It's perfect." Mrs. Fletcher, when approached about serving as a witness, shocked them both by bursting into tears and pulling Lillian into a fierce hug. "I knew it," she said triumphantly. "I knew from the very beginning that you two would find your way to each other. The church council can go hang. I'll be honored to stand up with you." Her support meant more than Lillian could say. It meant that not everyone in Red Hollow had turned against them. It meant that choosing each other hadn't condemned them to complete isolation. The night before the wedding, Lillian lay awake in her small bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she'd speak vows that would bind her life to Elias's permanently, for better or worse. She should have been terrified, should have been questioning this impulsive decision to marry a man she'd known for barely 3 months. A man who was still grieving his first wife, a man who'd rejected her so publicly just weeks ago. Instead, she felt oddly calm, certain even. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That was worth more than any perfect fairy tale. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with sunlight reflecting off snow so bright it hurt to look at directly. Lillian dressed carefully in her best dress, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and pinned up her hair with the only nice comb she owned. She looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older somehow, more certain, like someone who'd walked through fire and survived. Maybe that's exactly what she was. Elias was waiting in the kitchen when she came downstairs, and the look on his face when he saw her made all the difficult months worth it. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "So do you." It was true. He'd shaved carefully and was wearing what must have been his best shirt, still worn but clean and pressed. The scars on his face were as prominent as ever, but somehow they didn't look like damage anymore. They looked like survival. They rode to town together in the wagon, sitting close for warmth. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. Everything important had already been voiced in the quiet moments leading up to this. Red Hollow was bustling when they arrived, the usual Saturday morning crowd filling the streets. Lillian felt eyes tracking them as they made their way to the courthouse, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity. But she kept her head high and her hand firmly in Elias's, refusing to be ashamed. Judge Morrison was a portly man with kind eyes who seemed completely unbothered by the scandal that had brought them to his chambers. He ran through the ceremony efficiently, asking the required questions and waiting for their responses. When it came time for Elias to speak his vows, his voice was steady and clear. I, Elias Turner, take you, Lillian Moore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to stand beside you in all circumstances. This I vow before God and these witnesses. Then it was Lillian's turn, and she looked directly into Elias's eyes as she spoke. I, Lillian Moore, take you, Elias Turner, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to honor you, to support you, and to build a life with you based on honesty and respect. This I vow before God and these witnesses. The words were simple, almost plain, but they were real. They were chosen freely. And when Elias slid his mother's ring onto Lillian's finger, it felt like the most significant moment of her entire life. By the power vested in me by the territory, Judge Morrison said with a satisfied smile, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Turner. Elias hesitated for just a moment, uncertainty flickering across his face. Then Lillian rose up on her toes and kissed him gently, briefly, a promise of things to come rather than a claim of ownership. When they pulled apart, his eyes were bright and his smile was real. They emerged from the courthouse as Mr. and Mrs. Turner to find a small crowd gathered outside. Most faces were disapproving or coldly curious, but a few, including Mrs. Fletcher and, surprisingly, Sheriff Hayes's wife, looked genuinely happy for them. Congratulations, Mrs. Fletcher said warmly, embracing them both. Now, let's get you back to my boarding house for that dinner you planned. I've got a roast that's been cooking all morning. The celebration was small and quiet, attended only by Mrs. Fletcher, Sheriff Hayes, and his wife, and a young couple from a neighboring ranch who'd always been friendly to Elias. They ate roast beef and potatoes and fresh bread, and if it wasn't the grand wedding feast Lillian had once imagined, it was warm and genuine and full of real affection. To new beginnings, Sheriff Hayes said, raising his glass. May they be blessed with happiness and prosperity. They all drank to that, and Lillian felt something warm settle in her chest. This was family now. Not the one she'd been born to, not the one she'd imagined, but the one she'd chosen and built from the wreckage of broken dreams. As evening fell and it was time to head back to the ranch, Mrs. Fletcher pulled Lillian aside. You've made a good choice, she said softly. I know the circumstances weren't ideal, but I've watched Elias these past months. He's different with you, softer, more alive. You're good for each other. I hope so, Lillian said honestly. I'm still terrified I've made a terrible mistake. Marriage is always a risk. Mrs. Fletcher squeezed her hand. But it's a risk worth taking with the right person. And I think you found the right person, even if it took the scenic route to get there. The ride back to the ranch, to their home now, was quiet. Elias handled the reins while Lillian sat close beside him, the gold band on her finger catching the last light of day. It felt strange and new and significant all at once. No regrets? Elias asked as they approached the house. Not yet, Lillian said with a small smile. Ask me again in the morning. He laughed at that, a real laugh that made his whole face transform. Fair enough. Inside, the house felt different somehow, not physically changed, but altered in some fundamental way. This was their home now, their life, their future spreading out before them like uncharted territory. I'll make tea, Lillian said, moving toward the kitchen out of habit. Lillian. Elias's voice stopped her. You don't have to keep working, not tonight. You're not my hired help anymore." "Then what am I?" She turned to face him, genuinely curious. "My wife." The word sounded new on his tongue, like he was testing its weight. "My partner. My equal. And tonight, I'll make the tea. You sit down and rest." It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. Lillian sank into a chair and watched Elias move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been alone long enough to learn basic self-sufficiency. And she realized that this quiet domesticity, this simple sharing of tasks and space, was what marriage really looked like. Not grand gestures or perfect moments, but the daily choice to build something together. When Elias brought her the tea, he sat across from her at the table, and they looked at each other with something like wonder. "We actually did it," Lillian said softly. "We actually did," Elias agreed. "What happens now?" "I don't know." His smile was crooked, uncertain, but real. "I guess we figure it out as we go." And sitting there in the warm kitchen with snow falling outside, and her husband, sitting across from her, Lillian felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope she'd carried on that stagecoach 3 months ago. Not the dim hope of mere survival that had sustained her through those first difficult weeks. But real, solid, genuine hope. The kind that came from being chosen freely and choosing freely in return. The kind that came from looking at an uncertain future and knowing you didn't have to face it alone. Whatever came next, judgment from the town, financial struggles, the long process of learning to truly know each other, they'd face it together. And that made all the difference in the world. The first weeks of marriage were an exercise in careful navigation, like two dancers learning a new routine while trying not to step on each other's toes. Elias continued to rise before dawn to tend the cattle, but now he'd paused to kiss Lillian's forehead before leaving, a gentle gesture that never failed to make her heart skip. Lillian maintained most of her household routines, but with a new sense of ownership rather than obligation. This was her home now, truly hers, and every meal she prepared and every room she cleaned felt like an investment in their shared future rather than just earning her keep. They were learning each other in the small, intimate ways that marriage required. Lillian discovered that Elias liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was frustrated, and that despite his gruff exterior, he had a surprisingly gentle touch when handling injured animals. Elias learned that Lillian hummed while she worked, that she read every scrap of newspaper that came to the ranch with fierce concentration, and that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide when she thought she was right about something. But the town's judgment hadn't disappeared with their wedding vows. If anything, it had intensified. The first Sunday after their marriage, they'd tried to attend church services. Lillian had argued that presenting themselves as a respectable married couple might help ease the tension, might show the community that they had nothing to hide. Elias had been skeptical, but he'd agreed because she'd asked. They'd walked into the small church building together, Lillian wearing her best dress, and Elias in his wedding shirt, both of them hoping for at least basic civility. Instead, they'd been met with cold stares and whispered conversations that died the moment they got close enough to hear. When they'd tried to sit in a pew, the family already seated there had stood and moved to another section, making their disgust clear. The minister's sermon that morning had been about the corruption of moral values and the importance of maintaining community standards. He'd never mentioned them by name, but everyone in that building knew exactly who he was talking about. They'd left before the service ended, walking out into the cold winter air with as much dignity as they could muster. Lillian had felt tears of humiliation burning behind her eyes, but she'd refused to let them fall. Not where anyone could see. "We won't go back," Elias had said quietly on the ride home. "I won't subject you to that again." "They can't drive us out," Lillian had responded, her voice fierce despite the hurt. "We have every right to be there." "Having the right doesn't make it worth the pain." Elias had looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "Trust me, I learned that lesson years ago." So they'd stopped attending services, and that had only added fuel to the fire of gossip. Now they weren't just scandalous, they were godless. The minister made pointed comments about couples who turned their backs on the church, and Mrs. Crawford organized a prayer circle specifically dedicated to praying for the souls of those who'd fallen into sin. The social isolation was harder than Lillian had expected. When she went to town for supplies, conversations would stop when she entered the general store. Women she'd once exchanged pleasant greetings with would turn away, pretending not to see her. Even the store owner, Mr. Peterson, treated her with barely concealed disapproval, counting out her change without meeting her eyes. The only exception was Mrs. Fletcher, who remained steadfastly loyal despite pressure from the church community. She'd even had her credit threatened at the general store for continuing to associate with that Turner woman. But she'd simply laughed and told Mr. Peterson she'd take her business elsewhere if he was going to be ridiculous about it. Pay them no mind, she'd told Lillian firmly during one of her visits to the ranch. Small people with small lives always need someone to look down on. Makes them feel bigger. You just keep your head high and remember that you've done nothing wrong. But the isolation wore on them both. Elias grew quieter, more withdrawn, the old walls starting to rebuild themselves. Lillian caught him sometimes staring out at the prairie with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made her chest ache. She knew he was questioning his decision to marry her, wondering if he'd made her life worse instead of better. The breaking point came in late February, during a brutal cold snap that sent temperatures plummeting to dangerous levels. One of Elias's best breeding cows had gotten into difficulty during calving, and he'd been out in the barn for hours trying to save both mother and calf. Lillian had finally convinced him to come inside for hot coffee and food, worried that he'd freeze to death in his determination to save the animals. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, when someone started pounding on the front door. Lillian had opened it to find young Tommy Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher's grandson, standing on the porch, his face red with cold and exertion. "Mr. Turner," the boy gasped out. "Sheriff Hayes sent me. There's trouble in town. The church, they're trying to force Mrs. Fletcher to close her boarding house. They're saying she's harboring immoral influences by continuing to associate with you both." Elias was on his feet immediately, his exhaustion forgotten. "What?" "They've got the town council involved," Tommy continued, his words tumbling over each other. "They're saying her business license should be revoked because she's not maintaining proper moral standards. Sheriff Hayes is trying to hold them off, but he says he can only do so much against the minister and the church council. He thought you should know." Lillian felt ice settle in her stomach. Mrs. Fletcher was being punished for her loyalty. The one person who'd stood by them was now suffering consequences because of their association. "We have to do something," she said, turning to Elias. "We can't let them destroy her livelihood because of us." "What exactly do you propose we do?" Elias's voice was harsh, but Lillian could hear the pain underneath. "Stand up in front of the town council and defend ourselves. They've already decided we're guilty. Nothing we say is going to change their minds." "Then we don't try to change their minds." Lillian felt something crystallize in her chest, a determination born of weeks of swallowed humiliation and silent endurance. "We stand up and tell the truth, all of it, everything that happened from the moment I arrived until now. And we let them decide if punishing a good woman for showing Christian charity is really the moral stance they want to take." Elias stared at her for a long moment. "They'll tear us apart. You know that, right? They'll ask questions designed to humiliate you, to make you admit to impropriety whether or not any actually occurred." "Let them try." Lillian lifted her chin, that stubborn pride that had sustained her through so much rising to the surface. "I'm done being ashamed of surviving. I'm done apologizing for making choices that kept me alive and gave me a chance at happiness. And I'm done letting other people's small-mindedness dictate how I live my life." Something shifted in Elias's expression, that hard shell cracking open to reveal the man underneath. "You're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Lillian reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. "Mrs. Fletcher stood up for us when no one else would. Now it's our turn to stand up for her." They rode into town together that afternoon, with young Tommy leading the way on his horse. The town council meeting was being held in the church building, a pointed choice that made the power dynamics clear. By the time they arrived, it seemed like half of Red Hollow had crowded into the small space, eager to witness the confrontation. Mrs. Fletcher was standing at the front of the room, her face pale but determined, facing down the minister and 5 council members seated behind a long table. When she saw Elias and Lillian enter, relief flooded her expression. Mr. and Mrs. Turner, the minister said coldly, this is a closed council meeting. Your presence is neither required nor welcome. With respect, Reverend, Sheriff Hayes spoke up from his position near the door, if this meeting concerns their actions, they have a right to speak in their own defense. They have no defense for immorality, Mr. Crawford interjected sharply. The facts speak for themselves. Then let's discuss the facts. Elias's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. He moved to stand beside Mrs. Fletcher, and Lillian followed, forming a united front. My wife and I would like to address this council. There's nothing to address, the minister said dismissively. Mrs. Fletcher has been associating with individuals of questionable morals, thereby compromising the standards we expect from business owners in this community. Questionable morals? Lillian interrupted, her voice ringing clear in the crowded room. I'd like to know exactly what you're accusing us of, Reverend, because from where I'm standing, the only immoral behavior I've witnessed in this town is the treatment we've received from people who claim to follow Christian principles. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Women didn't speak to ministers that way. Women didn't challenge authority in public meetings. But Lillian was past caring about what was proper or expected. Young lady, the minister said icily, your brazen attitude only confirms what we've all suspected about your character. My character? Lillian took a step forward. Let me tell you about my character, Reverend. I traveled over 1,000 miles on the promise of marriage. I arrived in this town with nothing but hope and $17 to my name. And I was rejected, publicly, humiliatingly, by the man who'd sent for me. Do you remember that day? Because I certainly do. I remember standing in the middle of Main Street while everyone watched and whispered and judged. I remember the entertainment you all took from my humiliation. The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the minister seemed momentarily at a loss for words. I had two choices, Lillian continued, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I could spend my last few dollars on a ticket back east and try to survive with no job, no home, and no prospects. Or I could swallow my pride and accept Mr. Turner's offer of honest work for honest wages. I chose survival. And yes, that meant living on his property and working in his home. It meant sharing space with a man I barely knew because the alternative was freezing to death in an unheated cabin. You could have returned to town, Mrs. Crawford called out from the crowd. Could have taken proper work. What proper work? Lillian whirled to face her. Who exactly was offering me employment? You, Mrs. Crawford? Were you prepared to hire a disgraced mail-order bride with no references? Was anyone in this room ready to give me a chance? She let the silence answer for her. No. The only person who offered me anything was Elias Turner, and he did it without demanding anything inappropriate in return. He gave me work, a place to sleep, and treated me with more respect than I've received from anyone in this town. The fact remains, the minister said, trying to regain control, that you were living unchaperoned with a man. As hired help, Elias cut in, his voice hard. Sleeping in a separate building, eating separate meals, maintaining complete propriety at all times. And when winter made that arrangement dangerous, I offered her a spare bedroom in the main house because I wasn't going to let her freeze to death just to satisfy your sense of decency. And then you married her. Mr. Crawford's voice dripped with skepticism. Awfully convenient, wasn't it? Right when the scandal was getting out of hand. I married her, Elias said slowly, deliberately. Because over the course of 3 months, I watched her work harder than anyone I've ever known. I watched her bring life back to a place that had been dying. I watched her show kindness to animals and patience with difficult situations and strength in the face of constant judgment. I married her because she made me remember what it felt like to want something more than just survival, because she gave me hope when I thought hope was dead. His words hung in the air, raw and honest. Lillian felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. And yes, Elias continued, we married when we did partly because of the pressure this community put on us, but not because we were guilty of anything. We married because we were tired of defending ourselves against accusations that had no basis in truth. We married because we wanted to build a life together without constantly being questioned about it. We married because we chose each other, freely, honestly, and without regret. He turned to look at Lillian, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. I rejected this woman when she first arrived because I was scared and broken and convinced I didn't deserve a second chance at happiness. That was my mistake, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. But she didn't deserve the treatment she received from this town. She didn't deserve to be gossiped about and shunned and treated like a scandal just for trying to survive. Mr. Turner makes a compelling argument, Sheriff Hayes said quietly. Seems to me that the real question here isn't whether their behavior was improper, but whether we're going to punish Mrs. Fletcher for showing basic human kindness to people who needed it. She compromised community standards, the minister insisted, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Did she? Mrs. Fletcher spoke up for the first time, her voice strong. Or did I follow the actual teachings of Christ instead of the social conventions you gentlemen prefer? When did offering shelter to the desperate become a sin? When did standing by people who've been cast out become worthy of punishment? She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who'd known her for years. I've run my boarding house for 20 years. I've housed travelers and workers and anyone who needed a clean bed and a hot meal. And yes, I maintained friendship with Elias and Lillian Turner even when you all decided they were unworthy of basic respect. Because that's what Christians are supposed to do, show mercy, offer grace, and refuse to cast stones when we all live in glass houses. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Lillian could see some faces beginning to show doubt. Not everyone in Red Hollow had been comfortable with the harsh judgment, she realized. Some had just gone along because standing against the church seemed impossible. This is ridiculous, a new voice called out. Lillian turned to see a rancher she recognized from neighboring property standing up. I've known Elias Turner for 10 years. He's honest and hardworking and never given anyone cause to doubt his character. And I've seen how his place looks now compared to how it looked 6 months ago. That ranch was dying, and now it's thriving. That's not scandal. That's success. Hear, hear, another voice agreed, then another. Suddenly the room was full of people speaking up, breaking the united front the church had tried to maintain. The minister looked furious, his face red with indignation. This meeting is about Mrs. Fletcher's business license. Then let's vote on it, Sheriff Hayes suggested. Council members, do you really want to revoke the license of a respected business owner because she showed Christian charity, knowing that everyone in this room will see exactly what principles you value? The 5 council members looked at each other uncomfortably. Lillian could see them calculating, weighing their personal disapproval against the political cost of such an obvious injustice. Finally, the eldest, a man named Mr. Harrison, who ran the bank, cleared his throat. I move that we table this matter indefinitely, he said carefully. Mrs. Fletcher's business license remains valid, and we recognize that her association with the Turners is a matter of personal choice rather than professional misconduct. I second that motion, another council member said quickly, clearly eager to escape the uncomfortable situation. The vote was 3-2 in favor, with only the minister and Mr. Crawford dissenting. The crowd erupted in a mixture of reactions, some approving, some disapproving, all talking at once. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she turned to embrace Lillian. Thank you, she whispered. You didn't have to do that. Yes, we did, Lillian whispered back. You stood by us. We'll always stand by you. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out of the church, Lillian felt Elias's hand at the small of her back, solid and reassuring. They'd won this battle, but the war wasn't over. There would still be people who disapproved, still be judgment and whispers and social consequences. But something fundamental had shifted. They'd stood up and told their truth, and some people had listened. Not everyone would accept them, but they didn't need everyone. They just needed a few good people who were willing to look past scandal to see the reality underneath. The ride home that evening felt different, lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. The winter sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, and Lillian leaned against Elias's shoulder as the wagon rattled along the frozen road. That was terrifying, she admitted quietly. You were magnificent, Elias responded. I've never seen anyone face down that much judgment with such courage. I learned from watching you. Lillian smiled up at him. You've been standing alone against them for years. I just finally gave you someone to stand with. They completed the journey in companionable silence, and when they reached the ranch, the house welcomed them with warm light glowing through the windows. Someone, probably young Tommy before he'd ridden to fetch them, had kept the fires burning and the interior was cozy despite the bitter cold outside. "I'll check on the cow," Elias said, already moving toward the barn. "See if she and the calf made it through." "I'll start dinner," Lillian replied automatically, then paused. "Actually, no, I'll come with you. Dinner can wait." Elias looked surprised, but pleased. They walked to the barn together, and Lillian watched as he examined the cow and her newborn calf with gentle competence. Both animals had survived, and the calf was already standing on wobbly legs, nuzzling at its mother for milk. "New life," Lillian said softly. "Seems appropriate somehow." "Yeah." Elias reached out to steady the calf as it took its first stumbling steps. New beginnings all around. The weeks that followed brought gradual but unmistakable change. While the minister and his closest followers continued to shun them, others in Red Hollow began cautiously reaching out. A neighbor stopped by to borrow tools and stayed for coffee. The rancher who'd spoken up at the meeting invited them to a barn raising on his property. Mrs. Peterson, the store owner's wife, actually smiled at Lillian and asked how she was settling into married life. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was progress. And Lillian learned to take her victories where she could find them. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought transformation. The prairie burst into life with wildflowers and new grass. Cattle that had survived the brutal winter grew sleek and healthy on the rich grazing. The garden that Lillian had worked so hard to establish began producing vegetables in abundance. And slowly, carefully, Lillian and Elias's marriage deepened from a practical arrangement into something real and genuine. They developed rhythms and routines that felt natural rather than forced. Elias started lingering over breakfast to talk about plans for the day. Lillian would save interesting articles from newspapers to read aloud to him in the evenings. They worked side by side on ranch projects, learning to anticipate each other's movements and needs. The physical intimacy came slowly, carefully, built on trust rather than obligation. It started with small touches, hands brushing as they worked, Elias's arm around Lillian's shoulders as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lillian's fingers combing through Elias's hair as he rested his head in her lap. Each gesture was permission given and accepted, a slow building of comfort and desire that felt earned rather than assumed. The first time Elias kissed her, really kissed her, not the brief touch at their wedding, but something deep and passionate, they were in the kitchen where everything had begun. Lillian had been washing dishes, and Elias had come up behind her, turned her around, and looked at her with such intensity that her breath caught. "Can I?" he'd asked, his voice rough with want but still seeking permission. "Yes," she'd whispered, and then his mouth was on hers and the world narrowed to just that moment, that connection, that promise of more to come. That night, Lillian moved into Elias's bedroom, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because they'd both finally reached the point where sharing that space felt right and natural and like the next step in building their life together. The nightmares still came sometimes. Elias would wake gasping and disoriented, convinced he could smell smoke, and Lillian would hold him until the panic subsided. She'd learned not to try to talk him through it, just to be present, to anchor him with her touch, until he remembered where he was and that he was safe. "I'm sorry," he'd say afterward, always apologetic about his broken pieces. "Don't be," she'd respond every time. "This is part of you. I knew that when I married you." And somehow, over time, the nightmares became less frequent. Not gone. Lillian suspected they'd never be completely gone, but less consuming, as if having someone to hold on to in the darkness made the darkness a little less terrifying. Summer brought its own challenges and rewards. The ranch work was endless, but they tackled it together, and what might have been overwhelming for one person became manageable for two. They hired a young man from town to help with the heaviest labor, and Lillian discovered she had a talent for managing accounts and organizing supplies that made the business side of ranching run more smoothly. Mrs. Fletcher continued to visit regularly, and gradually other visitors followed. The rancher who'd defended them brought his wife to meet Lillian. Sheriff Hayes and his wife came for dinner. Even a few members of the church congregation Those who'd never been comfortable with the harsh judgment began cautiously extending friendship. The minister and his closest followers remained implacably opposed, and Lillian knew there would always be people in Red Hollow who saw her as scandalous. But she'd learned that she didn't need universal approval. She just needed her own clear conscience and the support of a few good people, and she had Elias. That mattered more than anything else. One evening in late summer, they were sitting on the porch watching fireflies dance in the growing darkness when Elias spoke suddenly. "I've been thinking about that locked room," he said quietly, "the one I told you never to enter." Lillian's heart clenched. They'd never discussed it again after that first day, but the locked door had remained a constant presence, a symbol of grief too heavy to touch. "You don't have to," she started, but Elias shook his head. "I want to. I think it's time." They went inside together, and Elias retrieved a key from a drawer in his study. His hands were shaking slightly as he fitted into the lock, and Lillian stood close behind him, offering silent support. The door swung open to reveal a room frozen in time. A child's bed, small and neatly made, toys on shelves, a woman's dressing table with brushes and combs still arranged on top, clothing hanging in the wardrobe. It was like a museum to loss, preserved exactly as it had been 5 years ago. "Sarah's things," Elias said roughly. "Thomas's things. After the fire, I gathered what had been salvaged and put it all in here. And then I locked the door because I couldn't stand to look at it, but I couldn't stand to throw it away either." "What do you want to do now?" Lillian asked gently. Elias was quiet for a long time, looking around the room with eyes that held pain, but also something else, maybe acceptance. "I want to let go," he said finally. "Not forget. I'll never forget them. But let go of the idea that keeping this room like a shrine somehow honors them better than moving forward with my life." Over the following weeks, they sorted through the room together. Some things, Sarah's jewelry, Thomas's favorite toy horse, a family Bible with carefully recorded names and dates, Elias packed away carefully to keep. Other things they donated to families in need, knowing that clothes and household items would serve better being used than sitting in a locked room gathering dust. It was painful work, and Elias grieved freshly with each item they handled. But Lillian saw healing in it too. The ability to touch these memories without being destroyed by them, to honor what had been lost while still making room for what might come next. When the room was finally empty, they stood in the doorway together, looking at the bare space. "What should we do with it?" Elias asked. Lillian considered. "Whatever you want. It's your house." "Our house," Elias corrected, taking her hand. "And I was thinking, maybe someday it could be a nursery again. Not to replace Thomas, nothing could do that, but to honor his memory by filling this house with life and hope and the sound of children laughing." Lillian's throat went tight. They hadn't talked about children yet, both of them still navigating the complexities of their unconventional marriage. But the hope in Elias's voice, the vision of a future that included more than just the two of them, made her heart swell. "Someday," she agreed softly, "when we're ready." Fall arrived with its usual spectacular display, the prairie grasses turning gold and amber under enormous skies. They prepared for winter with the confidence of people who'd survived one hard season and knew they could survive another. The house was tight and well-stocked, the barn was full of hay, and the cattle were healthy and strong. On a crisp October morning, Lillian woke to find Elias already up, standing at the bedroom window looking out at the sunrise. She moved to stand beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. 8 months, he said quietly. 8 months since we got married. Feels longer, Lillian admitted. In a good way, like we've lived a whole lifetime in that time. We have in some ways. Elias looked down at her, his scarred face soft with emotion. "You know what I realized this morning? I was standing here watching the sun come up, and I felt happy. Just simple, uncomplicated happiness. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Lillian reached up to trace the scar on his cheek, that permanent reminder of tragedy survived. "You deserve happiness. So do you." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. and I hope I'm giving you at least some of it. More than some. Lillian smiled up at him. You gave me a home, Elias. A real home. Not just a place to live, but somewhere I belong. Somewhere I'm wanted. That's worth more than I can ever tell you. They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and orange. In the distance, cattle were moving across the prairie, healthy and content. Smoke rose from Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house in town, promising warm fires and good food. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, were all the challenges and uncertainties that life would inevitably bring. But Lillian wasn't afraid anymore. She'd faced the worst that fear and judgment and social isolation could throw at her, and she'd survived. More than survived. She'd built something real and precious from the ashes of her shattered dreams. She'd found home in the last place she expected to find it, with a man who'd rejected her and then learned to love her, in a harsh land that demanded strength and gave beauty in return. And standing there in Elias's arms, watching the new day begin, Lillian Moore Turner understood something fundamental. The best stories aren't the ones that go according to plan. The best stories are the ones where everything falls apart and then gets rebuilt into something stronger than what existed before. Her story had started with rejection and humiliation, with 1,000 miles traveled for nothing and dreams crushed in the dust of a frontier town. It had continued through hard work and loneliness and the slow, painful process of earning respect from someone too broken to believe in second chances. But it had become something beautiful, something worth fighting for, something that proved love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, and second chances sometimes look nothing like what you expected. Winter came again, as it always did, but this time Lillian faced it with confidence. The house was warm, the pantry was full, and beside her was a man who'd learned that opening your heart again after devastating loss wasn't weakness. It was the bravest thing a person could do. They'd built this together, not a fairy tale, but something better, something real and solid and tested by fire. A marriage based not on desperation or convenience, but on genuine respect, hard-won trust, and the daily choice to stand together against whatever came next. And when spring returned, bringing new growth and new possibilities, Lillian planted flowers around the house, bright splashes of color that transformed the stark prairie landscape into something welcoming. She planted them in memory of the woman she'd been when she first arrived, desperate and unwanted. And she planted them in celebration of the woman she'd become, strong and loved and finally, completely home. Red Hollow never fully forgot the scandal. There would always be people who remembered that Lillian Turner had once been a rejected mail-order bride living in improper circumstances. But over time, the story changed. It became less about scandal and more about redemption, about two broken people finding healing in each other, about love that survived judgment and grew stronger for having been tested. And years later, when other mail-order brides arrived in Red Hollow, because they always did, drawn by hope and desperation in equal measure, it was Lillian they came to see. Lillian who offered them tea and sympathy and the assurance that even when dreams shatter, new dreams can be built from the pieces. Don't give up, she'd tell them, thinking of that first terrible day when she'd stood in the street with her whole world crumbling. Sometimes the story you're meant to live looks nothing like the story you imagined, but that doesn't make it any less beautiful. And she'd look at Elias, scarred, strong, steady Elias, and know with absolute certainty that she'd spoken the truth. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen, rebuilt piece by piece from broken dreams and stubborn hope, and she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. That was the real ending, Lillian thought, not perfect happiness or universal acceptance or the erasure of all hardship, just two people choosing each other every single day, building a life together with honesty and work and love that grew deeper with time. What had begun as rejection became redemption. What had begun as silence became home, and what had begun as survival became something far more precious, a love built by choice, tested by fire, and strong enough to last a lifetime. In the end, that was all anyone could really ask for.